listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I have the honor of having Jimmy Pardo on the show today. Jimmy is the host of Never Not Funny, and we are very lucky to sell ads on his show here at True Native Media. Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure to finally meet. We've been in business, I guess, 2 years now we've been working together.
Yes, 2 years. Yeah. And this is the first time we're having an actual conversation.
Yes, because you delegate conversation to people less on the totem pole than you, right?
I am learning delegation. It is not always easy, but I am learning, and it's been going well. So thank you for partaking in that delegation.
Sure, everybody has been wonderful. As we all know, that trickles from the top down. So,
well, thank you. Sure. Yes. So, Jimmy, you are a comedian, and you really have, I would say, one of the favorite shows on our team to sell, because I know advertisers always get really great results when they advertise with you. But before we talk a little bit about that, tell us kind of how the show came to be.
Well, it happened in 2006. I was doing a live, non-televised talk show at the UCB Theater here in Hollywood. And a young kid by the name of Matt Belknap was a fan of mine, and he had message boards were a big thing on the internet 18 years ago. And he had it was called thing.com, and it catered to the alt comedy scene, where I had a following in that world of alt comedy. And so Matt was a fan of mine who would come to all of my shows at the UCB or various other venues around Hollywood. And he came to me and asked me if I wanted to host a podcast and he would produce it. And I didn't really know what that meant. I knew he had interviewed me I guess it was for a podcast, but it was very dry, and it was very about, the business of comedy. And so he asked me again if I wanted to do it. And I had known about Ricky Gervais' podcast. And that was basically it. That's all I knew about podcasting. Maybe the Abbott and Costello podcast. That might have been like the only two that I was aware of. And so I said, let's do it. And I've never been fast on what is the new trend. And it took me forever to leave Friendster, to join MySpace, to join, what is the
Facebook? Yeah. Facebook.
My God, old man Pardo just completely. So I was always late on that. It took me forever to get on TikTok. I'm still not on Instagram. So when he said, you want to do a podcast? I was like, I don't know what that is, but I'm saying, yes, I'm getting in early. Too early to what? I didn't know. So we recorded one show that was just basically him recording my talk show at the UCB, and that wasn't right. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel like radio to me. It didn't feel like an audio. And so I said, you know what, let's just do this at my dining room table. Let's get the right equipment and let's do it. And it was going to be every other week, kind of a radio show, kind of a Jimmy Pardo diary of what's going on. And I would rant or whatever I would do comedically. And that quickly became me kind of just emulating my heroes from morning radio, Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer out of Chicago, and also Bob and Tom out of the Midwest, who I think were terrific. And it became that. And I had Matt as my producer, and I had a guy named Mike Schmidt for the first year, who then went on to do his own podcast called The 40-Year-Old Boy. And that was in 2006. And here we are. That answer took as long as we've been on the air.
What is really cool is that you've been doing this since 2006. I mean, I have been in the industry now for almost 9 years, and I just feel like that just seems like it's been forever, right? Like 9 years feels like forever. But you taught me. You've been doing this longer, which is pretty cool. So I guess I'm curious, like, has everything changed for you since you started? Because it doesn't even really feel like the same industry, I would imagine.
God, it is nothing like it was. I mean, obviously it was not, it was me and Ricky Gervais and The Onion, and we would battle it out for the number one spot, the number one podcast in the world. And so there was a time that I was the number one podcast in the world. And then the landscape changed a little bit, and famous people started doing podcasts. And I like to say we kind of got Walmarted out, like the Ma and Pa show got Walmarted out by the famous people that decided they wanted to have podcasts, but it it really changed, I guess, around the first change was around 2008 or nine, I want to say,
Mm.
where the comedy podcast boom happened. And
Hmm.
it happened to happen when Matt and I decided to go behind a paywall. And it was really interesting. The first 2 years, and people still talk about podcasting being the Wild West, and that who knows what's happening. But I think it's become a business, and it's basically it's the same as television at this point.
Yeah.
But back then, it really wasn't. It was dudes like me at their dining room table doing a show, and my show caught on very quickly because I we did have professional equipment. We weren't just talking into our computer microphones, and we weren't talking about tech stuff. And there was a lot of tech podcasts at the time. So I was
Hmm.
one of the few comedy podcasts. So we caught on right away. But then we also were kind of like, does anybody care? Like, what is podcasting? Is there a future in podcasting? You know, why am I doing this show? I'm a professional comedian. I should be making money if I'm providing content. You know, this was before people provided content on either for free even. And so it was like, why am I doing this? So we said, you know what? Let's go behind a paywall. Let's get a subscriber format going. And if people want to come along with that, they can
Hmm.
pay us, I believe it was just $5 a month to listen to us. And if
Hmm.
they don't want to do that, well, so be it. And we gave this a good 2 year run, and podcasting is not going anywhere anyway. So we'll just quit. And enough people came along with us that was like, oh, we now make a living podcasting. And I now can buy a house from podcasting. And it was crazy. And as I said, then the comedy podcast boom happened while I was behind that paywall. So adding new subscribers was really difficult because nobody really knew we existed, even though we were
Mm.
truly one of the first five, I think, comedy podcasts out there. So it was a weird time for us to decide. We didn't know this boom was about to happen. We went behind the paywall. The boom happened, and then we had to play a little bit of catch up a few years later of then offering a free feed with advertising, and
Mhm.
um, and that's kind of where we are now, where we do 2 episodes a week, and one is a subscriber, funded format, and then the other one is just goes out and then advertising supplement, provides the
Mhm.
dough
Mhm.
to keep that up and running.
Yeah. I'm just really curious why you let Joe Rogan get ahead of you.
I don't know how that happened either. I know it. I don't know why anybody listens to that, but that is me on my soapbox, and I don't know why we go to him for political thoughts or opinion or any of it. But he certainly came in and crushed us all. I mean, he did. And
Yeah, I mean, I just saw a report today about like his show has so I don't remember the percentage, of course that would be helpful right now, but his show has so many more listeners than like the next show down. It's kind of crazy how big his show has gotten. So do you I guess I'm curious, do you feel like part of the reason maybe you didn't grow at the pace that you were growing at was because you were behind the paywall? Do you think
yeah,
that that like hampered your growth a bit?
I think it 100% did. Like it really
Yeah.
just basically plateaued us early. Um,
Right.
and then we when we decided to come out from behind the paywall and we joined Earwolf. That was a huge comedy,
Yeah.
Scott Ackerman's company, and I know Scott for years, and he wanted us to join years earlier, but we just were like, we're a lone wolf. We got our own thing going on. Podcasting isn't about corporations and companies, and we were maybe a little naive and a little too arrogant, and we should have seen the writing on the wall sooner, but we didn't. But yeah, it plateaued, and then we joined Earwolf, and then we got a huge bump again. So
Mm.
then we once again were one of the top 10 podcasts for a while.
Mhm.
And then that, as I mentioned, that's then when Joe Rogan left television and Conan O'Brien decided to do it. And I mean, now Jason Bateman and Rob Lowe and movie
Right.
stars that go back to making movies. We started doing this because it was an alternative to not being on television at the moment, which is really kind of was in a little window between me hosting TV shows where I started my podcast. So yeah, I mean, in retrospect, maybe I would do things differently, but we didn't know back then. So I can't,
Sure.
it's, I mean, who knew podcasting was going to take off? Nobody.
Yeah. No, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, and I think what's so interesting about podcasting is that it has gone through so many kind of different iterations, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time I listened to a podcast, I had to download the file onto my computer. I had to upload it to my MP3. I wasn't very tech savvy. I feel like it took me like 4 hours to upload the podcast. And then I listened to it and the podcast was over in 30 minutes or something. I was like,
Right.
I'm never doing that again. That was,
Yeah.
just a pain. But then, of course, with the advent of the iPhone and having an app where it's so easy to listen to shows, I mean, all of that progression, I think, has made such a difference. And, I was searching for a podcast this morning and I was on Google and I thought, it's so nice that you can just click the video button or the image button and just get images or just get videos. And I thought, why do we not have an audio search button, right? Like, why doesn't Google make it so you can just say, I just want audio and all the podcasts would come up? But I mean, there is still so much, I think, on the horizon, which is part of the reason I do think that people still call it the Wild West. I think that we still do have more growth ahead of us. And
Hmm.
so that I think really adds to really just everyone's desire to keep kind of developing and changing. But one of the things that I always think is the value in podcasting is that we are kind of all of individual contributors, right? And so while maybe we've got the Spotify's and we've got the Googles and we've got the bigger companies that are in here, playing around, we are still all individual at some level. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of the industry. Do you agree?
I 100% agree. And for good or bad.
Sure,
I
sure,
think
absolutely.
I think that's the beauty of it is if a guy wants or a woman wants to do a podcast and one person wants to listen to it, they've succeeded. Like they've done what they want to do. They want to do their own show and they want to do their own thing and do it their way. And if they get an audience of one or certainly they want a bigger one, but that's the beauty of podcasting. It's like
Mhm.
we get to do what we want. And then I where it has changed is is with advertising and with the Patreon level or the Patreon style subscription basis where everybody now thinks it's kind of equivalent in comedy was Dane Cook was the first guy on MySpace and he made a career from MySpace. And then every comic was like, well, I just got to get on MySpace and I'll be famous like Dane Cook. And I think that kind of is happening with podcasting too. It's like, well, Joe Rogan and Adam Carolla and Conan O'Brien and to a lesser extent, Jimmy Pardo and Scott Aukerman and Mark Maron and we've been around forever. Those last few names. If I start a podcast, I'll be famous like those guys. And it's like, no, you'll be a drop in the ocean at this point,
Right.
and you have to offer something unique to break out from that. It can't just be, and I'm making fun of my own show here, just four dudes talking. It just can't be that. You have to find a unique take on why should your podcast stand out from all the other comedy podcasts. And I think some comics are a little naive and they just think I just need a podcast and then I'll have a following and then I'll be famous. And I don't think that that's the case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's 100% the case. And what I've found really fascinating is that when when people who have had successful podcasts for many years decide to start a new show, this has happened several times to me. I'll have a host, they'll have a super successful show, and they'll be like, you know what? I think I'm going to start a show about cooking or whatever, right? Like they decided to start this whole different podcast and they can't get that show to have traction at all. And part of it is that it's much more difficult to build an audience right now from scratch than I
Mm-hmm.
think it was before. The reality is that the space is more competitive now, obviously, than it was. And it's hard sometimes, right? Because it's even like you're competing with people who produce like 5 episodes, but like if you're searching for something, they still might come up. And it's difficult, I think, also because we often about that like 500 top shows out there and how they tend to get a disproportionately large amount of the attention in lots of ways, right? From the audience, from the advertisers. And it isn't super easy to get to where you want to be. But I think you make the point, which is also really important, that you do have to find out what that unique piece is for you, right? It's not just about sitting in front of a microphone and talking. You really
Right.
have to identify who it is that you're trying to reach and what sets you apart and why they would want to listen to you. But I guess I'm curious because when we think about the comedy space, comedy performs really well. I would say comedy and sports are two of the top performing genres for advertisers. And when I think comedy, I'm like, I just want to turn it on and listen to like a Netflix special, essentially on a podcast. But it doesn't seem like a lot of podcasts are really like that. So, what do you feel like kind of sets that comedy genre apart from other shows?
Boy, that's interesting. And by the way, it's interesting you didn't mention true crime because I thought true crime was
You
is
know,
that not in the top three
it's
anymore?
true crime is really not a super easy genre to sell. And part
Really?
of the reason is because advertisers are afraid that they are going to be associated with content that's not brand safe. And it's kind of funny to
Mm,
me because the people who listen to true crime are a huge, 25 to 35-year-old women who spend a
yes,
ton of money on products. So you would think
right?
that that's such a desirable market, and yet it's really difficult. And there are huge shows like Crime Junkie that do really, really well, but the vast majority of advertisers are concerned about advertising on true crime shows.
Well, I'm just a comedian, but I'll tell them they're wrong.
I would agree
Um,
with you.
I find that to be insanity. To me, that's just throwing a dart and getting a bullseye by advertising on true crime. But whatever they want to do, that's their business. But your question was what about? I derailed us with my concern about true crime not getting their due. Apparently,
No, I guess I'm just curious when you think about comedy shows and thinking about the format of a comedy show, what makes it so appealing to the audience?
you know what? I think if we go down to the basest of answers, and I think that's what makes it, my show appealing, is it reminds people of morning radio. And I think people are comforted by
Right.
morning radio and they want better than morning radio. They also don't want music. They want to listen. They turn on morning radio to hear comedy, and then they're interrupted with with commercials differently than we do on podcasts, of course. But
Mhm.
with 6-minute commercial breaks and then music breaks, and then by the time that happens, there's very little talk, and then they're at work. So I think comedy podcasting, is kind of taken the place of that. So I think that's what's appealing to people, that it's comforting and it's familiar. But I think comedy podcasts at the end of the day end up being people somewhat emulating that morning radio 3-person team sort of thing, or one guy talking to another person, and then let's bring a guest in. So I think it's comfort and familiarity, which is not an
Mhm.
easy word for me to say as I speak for a living. Um, I think that would be the answer.
Mhm.
Um, but I want to circle back very quickly on something you said that I can speak to personally. It's like we did try a second show at one point.
Oh, did
Um,
you?
yeah, called Playing Games with Jimmy Pardo. And the reason we thought to do that was my podcast has for some reason become 2.5 hours in length. Um, I don't get it either, but it has. And I understand if somebody then goes, "Hey, I hear great things about Never Not Funny, and Jimmy Pardo. I want to listen to that 2.5 hours. Geez, that seems like that's a chore. That's now that's my day. I don't, I just want to listen to some guy make me laugh on the way to work." So we thought we would make it a shorter version of that. So we did kind of a game show in a half-hour format that would kind of show the tone of Never Not Funny and my comedy, and the people that listen to Never Not Funny listen to that. And I'm grateful that they did,
Mhm.
because it was fun to do, but we didn't really get anybody new because, again, it was almost impossible to grow a new podcast. My wife currently, my beautiful and talented wife, Danielle Koenig, started a podcast, I want to say 18 months ago, called How to Survive with Danielle and Christine.
Mhm.
And it's a comedy podcast where for the first half, they teach you how to survive a bear attack, for instance. And then they'll bring a guest on, and that guest will relate a story about how they once survived, working at a souvenir shop in the forest, and Smokey the Bear or whatever. So it ties in some way,
Yeah.
and I believe that it should be the biggest podcast out there and I'm not just saying that because she's my wife. It's a great format. She and her partner Christine are hysterical, and the show they've got a great format, and they're offering something different than just the people chatting on comedy shows. But like I say, they're finding it hard to build an audience in this market that is just oversaturated. And I keep putting the blame on famous people coming in and taking the ad money and taking the listeners, because if somebody's going to go to the internet and go, I'm new to podcasting, who do I listen to? Oh, I recognize that person's name. I don't
Sure.
recognize their name. I should listen to that.
Right. Right. Right.
And it disappoints me because her show should be bigger than mine, and it's not.
I'm gonna have to listen because that sounds like a really fun
I think you'd
format.
love it.
That's really clever, really clever.
Yeah,
And I think getting that, like you said, it is something different. It's not just the two of them sitting there talking and making jokes,
yeah.
right?
It's I mean it's that you know they certainly have that as
Sure.
part of the show, but then they have a okay, let's figure out today how do you survive getting hit by a train, and then they
Right.
comedically tell you how to with real things how to you know, and then somebody will tell a story about how then they survived. How did I survive being in Europe when I missed my train or whatever, and then
Yes.
it's really great. It's really great, and it deserves to be huge.
Yeah, yeah.
There's my
Well,
commercial.
I have to say, I have been surprised also at how some celebrity shows don't grow either.
Interesting, right?
And you think, like, we definitely have had situations. My favorite story is at one point, we had an advertiser that wanted to buy certain shows. And so we reached out. I don't remember who the company was at the time that was working with the Ellen show, but like they had just launched Ellen's podcast and they were like, she's going to have 1 million downloads a month or some really big number. And I'm like, oh, that's very, ambitious of you, but maybe it's going to be there. And then I don't know, like 3, 4 months later, we got a hold of the numbers after it had actually launched and it was actually on air. And it was more like 300,000, right? Which was still like a great
Still,
audience, but
yeah.
it wasn't what they were projecting it to be. And I've even looked at Oprah's numbers for like Super Soul Sunday, and her numbers aren't even as big as you would think. And what I think is just really super fascinating, which I'm sure you can relate to, when there was network TV and, just terrestrial radio, there was so much less content out
Yeah.
there, right? And I've that the Oprah Winfrey show at like that 4 o'clock spot had the highest percentage of US viewers viewing that content of like any other content, or like we've talked about, of course, like the Super Bowl has really high percentage, because what we're doing now with so much content creation is we're dividing all of that attention into
Yeah.
millions of little strips, right? Millions of little seconds or views. And so it's really fascinating because we're never going to go back, right? We're never going to go back to the time where you could run a TV ad on the 5 o'clock news and get X number of people who were going to see that. And it was going to be this huge percentage. And yeah, maybe you spent millions of dollars, but you got the eyeballs of so many of your consumers. And I think that that's why we have seen kind of a shift in the way that advertisers advertise. And often in podcasting, podcasters say, well, I just want those brands, right? I just want those brand dollars. But we have a lot of direct response advertisers in the space now because it has to work because it does reach a smaller percentage of the
Mhm.
audience. And your show has worked very well for our advertising partners, which has been great. And I think that it's because you have such a loyal audience. What are your thoughts about why it's been successful?
I will go along with that. I think our audience trusts us. I mean,
Sure.
they've pushed back when we've had some advertisers that they didn't feel fit our brand.
That's great to
Um,
hear that they were like, hey, this isn't for us. Why are you guys
oh
doing this?
yes, and those are not pleasant emails to read.
No,
They
no.
nobody ever comes to that with a in a positive tone. Even though, well, please give us the benefit of the doubt. You enjoy our show. We're not, we didn't all of a sudden turn and go wackadoo. But I think it's that, and I also believe that a big part of it is, their ads are usually has to be a minute long, and ours. This will not be surprising because of my long-winded answers here. End up being about 2.5 minutes each. They're
Yeah.
lengthy, and because we want them to be entertaining. If somebody's not pressing that skip ahead button, and they're going to listen to the ads, we want the ads to be fun. We don't want to
Mhm.
just hit the talking points and then move on to the next ad. So I think those two things helps, in addition to the fact that we talk about things from the heart, and we try the products. We use so many times we've already used the product, and then coincidentally, then they become an advertiser. So
Mhm.
our audience trusts us
Mhm.
that, I'll just use an example that Factor Meals. It's like, I don't cook. My audience knows I don't cook. They know I don't know how to cook. And so when I talk about how Factor Meals has changed my life and they're delicious, and I get to pop it in, and 4 minutes later I have a delicious meal, they're like, well, boy, Jimmy doesn't cook, and he's picky about everything. And if he likes this, I believe him. So I think
Right.
that's why. And I think, again, more importantly, I think we're entertaining when we present all of that. Because, again, we are not and I don't really disclose our numbers, but we're not the biggest anymore. And
Mhm.
the fact that advertisers still come to us, I think it's because they might see a better response from our show than they would with even a bigger show.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. And one of the things I try so hard to make sure advertisers understand and podcasters, more importantly, understand is that if somebody isn't going to listen to your ad, then it isn't going to get a response.
Right.
And you and I both have listened to shows where we're like, ugh, like fast forward, like this
Mm-hmm.
isn't interesting at all. And so the fact able to make the ad feel like content and feel entertaining to that person makes them listen to it. And if they listen to it, then they might actually take action. Where is if they're hitting that fast forward button, nothing is going to happen. And so, really putting that intention, and that's where the power of that host read ad comes into play, right? Because it isn't us just putting some announcer ad on there where we're like, hey, this, it's almost like an announcer read ad is like, this isn't really for me, right? Like
Right.
this isn't something I have to listen to. Whereas if you as the host are bringing, a story essentially about a product or about a brand to your audience, they're much more likely to pay attention.
Yeah, they don't want to miss it because
Right.
maybe that week that's the funniest thing I've said, and they would feel badly if they missed. Oh, I don't remember him saying that. Oh, it was during the Manscape ad or whatever it would be.
Sure.
And it's like, oh, then they go back and listen or whatever. They just don't want to. So they listen to it. And even I'll say this, even our subscriber base, which is offered without ads, the bulk of them still listen to the one with the ads because I'm lucky that they enjoy my nonsense. So
Sure,
and
sure.
then in turn, advertisers. And I will say this about what you just said too, and made me think of this. When there are, and it's been very few and far between, but there have been advertisers that will handcuff us a little bit and
Oh,
say,
sure.
you can't say this, you can't say that. And it's like, right. But then, oh, what was one recently? Well, I don't know. Where it was like, that's not family friendly to say. My show's not family friendly. Like
Right.
so like why would I do a family friendly read if my show is for 35 to 65 or 25 to, you know what I mean? So it
Right.
was like, so you've just handcuffed me and being honest about this product by making me cater to somebody that's not listening to my show because that's you as an advertiser afraid of the wording or whatever. So I think that when we are allowed to just be as free as we want with the reads, I think people respond to them because it
Right.
doesn't sound like a read. That's the key.
Well, and I think it's so challenging sometimes with advertisers. And I get where they're coming from, right? Like they've done all the research studies and they have all of their superiors to, answer to who are like, hey, what are you talking about? And how are you talking about it? But at the end of the day, you want someone to read your ad who's going to say really sincere, interesting things about your product. And I also think that part of the reason that host read ads are appealing is when an ad does feel like the rest of the show, then it feels like the rest of the show.
Right.
Whereas if it's this like very scripted, all of a sudden, why don't they just have an announcer read it? Right. And so
Yes.
really allowing a host to bring their personality and the content that we audience already likes into that ad read, I think is really super powerful. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm curious, this is putting you on the spot a little bit. Has there been a brand where your audience has just like gone crazy? Like, because I think a lot of times hosts don't necessarily hear a ton of feedback about
Right.
their advertisers, but you've been doing this for so long. Has there ever been a brand where like you were like, oh my gosh, my audience obviously loves this product because they've responded so well?
It's going back a few years, but I know that Casper mattress did very well. People
Yeah.
of all, I mean, and a mattress is not an easy purchase. Like so, but we got a ton of emails saying I bought a Casper mattress because of you guys, and I would say other U-turn turntables did pretty well for us. I remember people responding about a lot about that because again, they know I collect vinyl, and so it's coming from the
Uh-huh.
heart. So if I'm talking about a turntable, they're going to trust me. Um, those are the two that come to mind. And then Factor Meal, of course, we get a lot of
Sure.
people
Positive.
trusting us on Factor Meals. And there's other ones that people just, I think they just go, well, you know what, they need to make money too, and that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Sure.
But those are the three I think that really stand out to me: the Factor and U-turn turntables and Casper. And that's a hint to Casper that they're welcome back anytime.
Well,
Or
no, I was
Purple.
just gonna say, Jimmy, I think people buy mattresses like every 10 years, and it's probably been about 10 years
Yeah,
since
it
Casper
has been.
advertised. So I think that it's time
Yeah.
for another mattress advertiser. If it's not Casper, there are a few others that might be a great fit.
Well, we'll bring them on. We also did well with Purple a few years back. And then I think Ghost Bed is the new one. I don't know. We are not advertising Ghost Bed yet. Is that a brand?
I
Am I?
have to say, I feel like I should know all these brands, but Ghost brand does not ring a bell for me. But that doesn't
Ghost?
mean that they aren't advertising. So I'm gonna have to write that down and look that up.
I think it's a thing. I'm looking up Ghost Bed right now because I don't want to. Or should I? Why do they get the free ad?
It's
Why?
true. I know. I know. All of the millions of people who listen to this show are going
Uh,
to now go look up Ghost Bed
no, it's a
and
thing. It's
it
ghostbed.com. Yeah,
is.
and
Okay. Well, I'm going to definitely have to get on Ghost Bed and make sure that we're bringing them into the true native fold here.
I'm told by this that they have the best mattresses or back sleepers. That's what this tells me.
Ah, well, there you go. If you're a
Again,
back
this is not
sleeper.
this is not an ad. This is not an ad for Ghost Bed.
It is not. So I'm curious if you were to give advice for advertisers in this space, what advice would you give? So we've already talked about the fact that, like, hey, don't handcuff us when it comes to talking points. But is there any other advice that you would give, like, as a podcaster, as someone who has interacted now with, I'm sure, hundreds of different brands over the years? What do you think advertisers could be doing better?
I was going to repeat it. It's just trust the hosts.
Yeah.
Trust us that if you came to us for a reason, trust us. We're going to sell this. I
Hmm.
equate it a lot to having done stand up for as long as I have, and I've done many a corporate gig where you show up and you do a show in front of some corporation's Christmas party or whatever, and they don't always go great, to be honest. And one of the reasons is the person that hired you is so afraid their boss is not going to have a good time that they kind of restrict you from doing your act the way that you should do your act. And I'm speaking
Hmm.
as a comedian. And
Hmm.
so they're like, make sure you don't do this, make sure you don't do this, make sure you don't do this. And then at the end, it's like, well, then why'd you hire me? You're asking me to,
Right.
you hired me for a reason. Now you're asking me to be a completely different comedian because you're afraid your boss may not like it. And I guess I kind of equate that to this of, if you're going to advertise on specific shows, yes, Sarah Koenig is not going to read it the same way I'm going to read it,
Hmm.
nor should we.
Hmm.
It's two different audiences, two different listeners at that moment. Hers would be crazy if hers was as loose and stupid as mine, and mine would be awful and ineffective if I was. Let's now talk about Factor meal. Factor is delicious, and it clear.
Right.
So it's that. And again, I know I'm repeating it and just using different words, but that would really have been my answer had this been the only question you asked me all day.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think that that means so much because, again, we have to go back to this idea that you know your audience
Yes,
better than anybody else. And so the advertiser needs to empower you to reach your audience in the way that you can reach them. And you've spent all of these years speaking to that audience, so you know them best.
it's true. And you know what? And also less onboarding calls would be great. But I just had two great onboarding calls. Usually they're really uncomfortable and weird. But the last two were great. And they basically started by saying, hey, we listened to your show. We're advertising with you because we like the way you do reads. So you will never get notes from us. And it's like,
Awesome.
you hear that. It's like, now I will say, I was already doing that, but now it's like knowing that you have that free reign makes it even more comfortable. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. 100%. So what about podcasters? If some podcaster was listening right now and they were like, "Gosh, I really would love to monetize my show." I mean, you've already talked about the fact that you have, a great subscriber base. You've obviously been doing ad reads for several years. What advice would you give a podcaster on how to kind of transition into a place where they could get advertisers on their show?
Boy, you know what? This is where I'm a dinosaur in this business, in that because I've been around so long. I don't know the answer to that because I don't know the lay of the land
Hmm.
of what's happening currently, even though my wife has a podcast that she's trying to do that. And we don't know. We
Hmm.
don't know. And it's like you try certain things, bonus episodes, this, that, adding additional content to try to lure people over. How do you keep people? Do you give them a t-shirt if they subscribe? What do you do? And I don't have the answer to that. I really
Hmm.
don't. I mean, I get famous. Is that the
Yeah. I I mean, actually, that really is the answer at the end of the day, right? I mean, when we think about advertisers, advertisers do want to reach a big audience.
Yeah.
And as much as I would love to say, like, oh man, you've got 1,000 listeners, like, come on, like, yeah, we can sell ads for you. At the end of the day, you really do have to have an audience in order for advertisers to be interested in your show. And I think sometimes people get the numbers like maybe messed up in their heads a bit. We know that, and there's a gentleman in the industry that like, hey, if you were sitting, speaking to an auditorium of 250 people, that would feel like a lot and you would be happy. And he's right. If I were standing in front of an audience of 250 right now, I would feel very differently than sitting here in the comfort of my chair, talking on my mic. And I get that it's similar, but when you think about it from an advertiser's perspective, they have to look at how many people are in the market today for their product.
Mm,
And it's not really that great, right? So either somebody has a demand for the product, they have a real need that they're like, hey, I need new tires, I'm going to go get them today. Or you have to create that desire or the demand for the product. And there's only a small percentage of people who are going to be buying a mattress, right? It's like,
right.
how many people are lined up today to say, like, hey, I need a new mattress? There are people out there, right? I'm sure thousands of people. But if we look at your audience and you're only reaching 1,000 people, that might be right. That might be two people. And it's just not going to be enough for that advertiser
Right.
to want to come. So at the end of the day, it really is about building an audience. And it's not an easy thing to do, but I think
Mm-mm.
the great part about it is when we look at someone like yourself, you have been able to build the audience and really sustain the audience. And I guess I'm curious, do you feel like now that there are so many different choices, what makes someone decide to stay with you and listen to your show each day?
I think it's people that have been with us a long time, and I get these emails. When I started the show during the first year, I announced my wife is pregnant, and my son is about to turn 17. So they have seen my son be born, not seen, but been with me since he was born to now 17 years old. At the same time, they had kids, and so I think they're kind of just going on the journey along with me of a man of a certain age, and we do have young listeners, which fascinates me because they even come up to me after shows. They go, I don't get your references about Journey and REO Speedwagon. I don't have a 17-year-old son. I'm not married, but man, do I love listening to you guys. And so that fascinates me. But I think for the most part, people have just stayed with us. Not only are they loyal, which I'm forever grateful for, but I think it's because we're kind of they're I hate the sound, they're kind of, we've become like a friend to
Right,
them.
right,
And that, oh, Jimmy's talking about Oliver, how he's raising Oliver and how Oliver's doing this at school. That's the same thing that's happening with my son or daughter. And I think
right.
that they have a way to relate about that instead of being at a mommy group or a daddy group where it's like maybe people aren't 100% honest, or maybe people are trying to show how great of a parent they are, like where they can go, oh, Jimmy's being honest about how this is awkward or weird. So I think that's a big part of it. I think it's our openness and honesty that just keeps them sticking around. And I would also hope maybe funny. I don't know, maybe hope that's
I'm
part of
sure
it.
it's the humor that's what keeps
I
them
would
there.
I would hope so. Although some would argue with us, we have gotten like everybody else in 2016 when everything changed politically, we got a little more political than some folks would like, and
Mm,
that was where we lost more listeners there than anything. And
yeah,
but I'm okay with it because it's like I stand by that I'm on the right side of history, and if you don't want to be, then go. There's plenty of shows out there for you. So
right.
so there was that, but I think for the most part, people stay with us because of I'm providing humor and also relatable stories. Good,
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
end of
No,
that sentence.
absolutely. Yeah. Relatable. Yeah. You're relatable. Well, and I think what's so interesting, my daughter is 16 and it's like I look at, just different actors and like this last week I have had a couple of flights. And so I've been, I always download things I would never watch onto my phone for the flight. And two shows that I watched, I'm like, wait, like that actor used to be the lead in this rom-com, not the dad in the
Right.
rom-com. And I'm like, and it's just weird because it's like as you age and as you go through life, you see your entertainers around you mirroring what you're going through in
Mhm.
your life. And there is that relatability, and it's what the connection's about. And I think it's, for me, it's what that power is about in audio, because when somebody's on a screen, they feel more removed. When they're
Yes,
in your ear,
they're right there.
they feel like a friend, and they feel like somebody that and I think you also hear them in conversations. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I think you need a new format. I forever love interview podcasts, though. I feel like I could listen to them all day long, because for me, it's so cool to listen to an interview, someone that I would never be in the room in that conversation, right? Like I would never be able to talk to that person, and yet I can listen to the interview, which to me is pretty cool. And it's that intimacy that really, I think, it makes podcasts so powerful.
I will agree 100% with that. And what also happens, to your point, um, the guard is let down unintentionally because they forget that everybody that it's going to the world. Even on our show, people come into our studio and they'll tell us a story, and then they'll get in their car and go, "I can't let that story go out to the world. Yeah, I thought we were just at a table talking." So, celebrities, I think they are the rawest on podcasts. And it's not, they're not produced like late night talk shows where it's like the Q&A is all set up and I'll set you up for that time that you threw a golf club on the golf course, sort of thing. Um, so I think it's I think that then people, and in my case with Never Not Funny, I think they just are loyal because we are in their ears and we are their friends. And I am forever grateful that they care. I really am. I'm the luckiest man that our audience stays with us and they care at all. I mean that.
For sure, for sure. My favorite is, I was interviewing a gentleman one day, and he kept saying, "Well, just between us." And I was
It's like,
like, "You do realize this is
right,
an interview that will not be just between us,
right,
right?" It was pretty funny. But people do. It's like you let your guard down. You
absolutely,
don't think about what it is that you're producing. And it creates that intimacy, which is really powerful.
yeah.
So
And I think at the end of the day, I think Howard Stern had a lot to do with that too. I think
sure.
Howard Stern interviewing celebrities and getting them to open up in that way, and he's even better now than he ever was in the past. But I think that had a lot. I'm not emulating him in any way, shape, or form. I'm certainly not comparing myself to him, but I think it opened the door for these maybe more raw interviews, more intimate interviews.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for being on the show today.
My
And
honor.
if people want to find your podcast, where can they find it?
Of course, nevernotfunny.com, or just go to jimmypardo.com, which of course has links to the podcast, or it's on all the, podcast platforms and wherever you would download your podcast. Never Not Funny is there for your listening needs.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you want to advertise on the Jimmy Pardo show, Never Not Funny, all you have to do is reach out to True Native Media. We'd be happy to sell you a mattress ad. Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. If you have not checked out my YouTube channel, head on over to YouTube, where we create lots of great content about podcast advertising. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.